October 12, 1945, Camp Crossroads, Oklahoma. The convoy of trucks rolled through the gates carrying prisoners the guards had never seen before, women in German uniforms, exhausted, terrified, expecting the worst. That night in the mess hall, something happened that would change everything. The American cook placed golden, crackling pieces of something on their plates, something they'd never seen in their lives. The first woman to taste it froze mid-bite, her eyes going wide. Within seconds the entire table went silent. What could possibly make battle-hardened soldiers from Nazi Germany stop eating and stare at their plates in complete shock? The answer would break every assumption they had about their captors, about America, and about what it meant to be defeated. One simple food would do what months of propaganda couldn't. The trucks rumbled through the gates of Camp Crossroads just as the sun began its descent over the Oklahoma plains, casting long shadows across the dirt roads that crisscrossed the sprawling prisoner of war facility. Lieutenant Sarah Mitchell stood at the processing station, clipboard in hand, watching as the convoy came to a halt in a cloud of dust that turned golden in the late afternoon light. She'd been warned that this transport would be different from the usual shipments of captured Wehrmacht soldiers they'd been receiving since D-Day, but nothing had quite prepared her for the sight of women in German military uniforms stepping down from the trucks, their faces pale and drawn, their eyes scanning the camp with a mixture of fear and defiance that Sarah recognized from every other prisoner who'd arrived here over the past 18 months. The facility had been built quickly in 1943, a maze of wooden barns and administrative buildings surrounded by double fences and watchtowers, designed to hold the flood of German and Italian prisoners that everyone knew would be coming once the tide turned in Europe. Captain James Warren, the camp's deputy commander, had explained to her just that morning that these women were mostly from auxiliary units, communications specialists and clerical workers who'd been captured during the final push into Germany, and that Washington had decided to send them here rather than to the overcrowded facilities on the East Coast. The lead truck's tailgate dropped with a metallic clang, and Sarah watched as the first woman climbed down, her movements stiff and careful, as if she expected the ground itself might betray her. She was perhaps 30 years old, with dark hair pulled back in a severe bun, and when her eyes met Sarah's, there was a flash of something that might have been surprise, maybe at seeing another woman in uniform, before her expression closed off again into that neutral mask that prisoners learn to wear. Behind her came others, young and old, some moving with military precision, others stumbling with exhaustion, all of them carrying the same small canvas bags that held whatever possessions they'd been allowed to keep. Sergeant Robert Davis, one of the MP guards, approached Sarah and spoke in a low voice about the head count and processing procedures, but she was only half listening, her attention caught by a younger woman near the back of the group who couldn't have been more than 19, her face still carrying some of that softness that hadn't yet been worn away by war. The girl was crying silently, tears making clean tracks down her dusty cheeks, and Sarah felt an uncomfortable tightness in her chest, a reminder that these weren't just prisoners, they were people, caught up in something bigger than any of them had asked for. The camp had been her assignment for 8 months now, and she'd learned to maintain that professional distance, to see the prisoners as her responsibility, but not her concern. But something about this moment, these women standing in the Oklahoma dust thousands of miles from whatever homes they'd left behind, made that distance harder to maintain. Captain Warren emerged from the administration building, his boots crunching on the gravel path, and began barking orders about processing and barracks assignments, his voice carrying that particular tone of military authority that demanded immediate compliance. The women were formed into rough lines, and Sarah began the tedious process of checking names against her manifest, recording serial numbers and personal information, asking questions through the interpreter they'd brought in from the university in Oklahoma City, a stern older woman named Mrs. Hoffman who'd emigrated from Bavaria in 1938, and who approached her duties with a kind of grim determination. Each prisoner was photographed, fingerprinted, and searched for contraband, the whole process moving with the mechanical efficiency of a system that had been refined through thousands of previous arrivals. Sarah noticed that some of the women kept glancing toward the mess hall, drawn perhaps by the smell of cooking that drifted across the camp on the evening breeze, and she realized with a start that they probably hadn't eaten anything substantial in days. maybe weeks, given the chaos of the German collapse and the long journey across the Atlantic. The sun was touching the horizon when they finally finished processing the last prisoner, and Sarah felt the exhaustion settling into her bones like cold water, but there was still the matter of getting them fed and settled into their assigned barracks before lights out. Captain Warren had designated Barracks 7 and 8 for the women, buildings that had been hastily modified with additional privacy screens and separate facilities, an acknowledgement that however much the military tried to treat all prisoners the same, there were some accommodations that simply had to be made. As Sarah led the first group toward their quarters, she found herself walking beside the dark-haired woman who'd been first off the truck, and in a moment of impulse she couldn't quite explain, she said in careful German practiced from a language course she'd taken in college, that dinner would be served in an hour, and that tomorrow they'd begin the orientation process. The woman looked at her with those same guarded eyes, and for just a moment Sarah thought she might respond, might crack that wall of silence, but instead she simply nodded once and looked away, and Sarah understood that whatever bridge might eventually be built between captor and captive, it wouldn't be constructed in a single evening. The barracks were spare but clean, rows of metal bunks with thin mattresses and wool blankets, a far cry from the horrors Sarah had heard about in the German camps, but nothing like home either, just a place to exist until the war finally ended, and someone figured out what to do with all these displaced people. She watched as the women claimed their bunks, some collapsing immediately onto the mattresses, others moving with that same military precision to arrange their few belongings, and she wondered what they were thinking, whether they were relieved to be alive and out of the fighting, or whether they felt only shame and fear about what came next. The dinner bell rang across the camp, a sound that brought the usual rush of prisoners toward the mess hall, and Sarah waited as the women assembled in the space between the barracks, their faces showing apprehension about this next unknown experience, this next small humiliation in a long series of defeats. The mess hall fell into an eerie silence as Sarah led the women through the entrance, and she felt every eye in the building turn toward them, hundreds of male prisoners interrupting their dinners to stare at this unprecedented sight, women in Wehrmacht uniforms walking past their tables toward the serving line. The building was massive, one of the largest structures in the camp, capable of feeding over 2,000 prisoners in shifts, its walls lined with motivational posters about the war effort and regulations posted in both English and German. She'd eaten here herself countless times, sitting at the small table reserved for camp personnel, and she'd grown accustomed to the din of conversation in a dozen different dialects, the clatter of metal trays and utensils, the smell of institutional food that wasn't quite good, but wasn't quite bad either, just fuel for bodies that needed feeding. But now that comfortable familiarity felt charged with something else, a tension that crackled in the air like electricity before a storm, and she found her hand resting on the holster of her sidearm, a gesture she immediately regretted because it showed her own nervousness to everyone watching. Captain Warren had assigned extra guards for this first meal, MPs stationed at regular intervals along the walls, their presence a reminder that this was still a military facility, still a place where order had to be maintained above all else. But Sarah wondered if they'd be enough if something went wrong, if some angry prisoner decided to make a scene or worse. The women moved in a tight group, their shoulders almost touching, a defensive formation that spoke of their own awareness of being watched, being judged, being the object of attention they clearly didn't want. At the serving line, the camp cooks stood ready with their ladles and serving spoon. Black soldiers from the quartermaster corps who'd been assigned to kitchen duty, because that was where the army usually put black soldiers regardless of their skills or ambitions, and Sarah saw the moment when Private Jackson, who normally greeted everyone with a joke or a smile, caught sight of the women and his expression shifted into something more careful, more professional. The menu tonight was what the prisoners called American food, though Sarah suspected it bore only passing resemblance to what most Americans actually ate, a strange institutional interpretation of home cooking that involved a lot of starches and not much seasoning. On the steam tables sat great vats of mashed potatoes, green beans that had been boiled into submission, dinner rolls that were somehow both hard and soggy, and the evening's main course, something that made several of the German women stop and stare with expressions of confused. Fried chicken, golden brown and glistening with grease, piled high in serving trays, each piece, coated in a crispy breading that the camp cook, Sergeant Willie Thompson from Louisiana, had perfected over months of trial and error, using his grandmother's recipe adapted for industrial quantities. Sarah had eaten Thompson's chicken dozens of times and considered it one of the few genuinely good things about camp food, but watching the German women examine it with obvious bewilderment, she suddenly saw it through their eyes. This strange preparation of poultry that looked nothing like the roasted or boiled chicken they would have known from home. The dark-haired woman from earlier, whose name Sarah had learned was Hauptfeldwebel, Greta Zimmermann, a technical sergeant in what had been the signals corps, leaned forward slightly and said something in rapid German to the woman beside her, and Sarah caught enough words to understand she was asking what kind of food this was supposed to be. Miss Hoffman, the interpreter, had accompanied them to help with any issues, and she stepped forward now to explain in German that it was chicken prepared in the American Southern style, fried in oil with a flour coating, and that it was considered quite good by American standards. Greta's expression suggested she found this explanation less than reassuring, but hunger was a powerful motivator, and when Private Jackson placed a piece on her tray along with scoops of the other offerings, she accepted it with the same neutral expression she'd maintained since arrival. The women filed past the serving line one by one, each receiving the same portions as the male prisoners, the military's commitment to equality in rationing if nothing else, and Sarah noticed how some of them held their trays as if the food might attack them, while others seemed too exhausted to care what they were being fed. They were directed to a section of tables that had been roped off from the main dining area, another accommodation to prevent incidents, and as they settled onto the bench, Sarah saw the younger girl who'd been crying earlier, simply staring at her tray with an expression of complete overwhelm, as if this strange meal was the final incomprehensible piece of a world that had stopped making sense. Around them the male prisoners had resumed eating, but the conversations remained muted, and Sarah caught glimpses of men at nearby tables watching the women with expressions that ranged from curiosity to resentment, to something that might have been pity. Sergeant Davis approached her table and muttered that everything seemed to be under control, that the men were behaving themselves, but Sarah could feel the fragility of that control, could sense how easily the situation could tip into something ugly. At the women's tables no one was eating yet, everyone waiting for some signal or permission, and Sarah realized they were probably used to different protocols, different rules about when and how meals were conducted, so she nodded to Miss Hoffman, who announced in German that they were free to begin. The sound of utensils against metal trays gradually filled their section, and Sarah watched as Greta Zimmermann picked up her fork, examined the piece of fried chicken on her plate with scientific curiosity, and then carefully cut off a small piece, her movements precise and deliberate, as if she were conducting some kind of experiment rather than simply eating dinner. Greta Zimmermann had survived 3 years of war, had watched cities burn and empires collapse, had learned to sleep through artillery barrages, and to keep working while the world ended around her in slow motion, but somehow this moment, sitting in an American prison camp in Oklahoma, with a piece of fried chicken on her fork, felt more surreal than anything she'd experienced in those 3 years of madness. The meat was still hot enough to release steam when she cut into it, revealing white flesh beneath that golden crust, and the smell that rose from it was unlike anything she associated with chicken, a rich, savory aroma mixed with something she couldn't quite identify, some combination of spices and fat that her empty stomach responded to with an almost painful rumble. Around her, the other women were conducting their own cautious investigations, approaching this strange food with the same careful attention to detail that had been drilled into them during their military service, as if proper intelligence gathering could somehow make sense of American cuisine. Beside her, Oberfeldwebel Anna Richter, who'd been her friend and colleague for 2 years, leaned close and whispered that she'd heard Americans ate very strange things, that their food was nothing like proper German cooking, and that they put sugar in everything including bread, which seemed to Anna like definitive proof of cultural degeneracy. Greta might have laughed at that under different circumstances, might have pointed out that judgments about cultural superiority seemed somewhat hollow coming from prisoners of a defeated regime, but she was too tired and too hungry for philosophical discussions about the meaning of their situation. She raised the fork to her mouth and took that first bite, expecting something awful, or at least aggressively foreign, but what she tasted instead was something that short-circuited all her expectations and made her freeze mid-chew, her eyes widening in genuine surprise. The exterior was crispy and intensely flavorful, the breading carrying notes of salt and pepper, and something else she couldn't name, while the meat itself was tender and juicy in a way that seemed almost impossible given the cooking method. And the combination of textures and tastes created an experience that her war-rationed, substitute ingredient-trained palate couldn't quite process except to recognize it as unambiguously, almost offensively good. She swallowed, aware that Anna was watching her reaction, aware that several other women at the table had paused their own explorations to see what Greta would say, and for a moment she couldn't say anything at all because the food demanded her full attention, demanded that she immediately take another bite to confirm that the first one hadn't been some kind of hunger-induced hallucination. The second bite was even better than the first, if such a thing were possible, and she found herself eating with a focus and intensity that probably wasn't dignified for someone of her rank and position, but dignity seemed like a luxury she couldn't afford when faced with the first genuinely satisfying meal she'd had in months, maybe years if she were being honest with herself. Around her, the other women were having their own moments of discovery, their expressions shifting from suspicion to surprise, to something that looked almost like guilty pleasure, as if enjoying their captor's food represented some kind of betrayal. Young Gefreiter Helga Schneider, the girl who'd been crying earlier, had stopped crying entirely and was eating her chicken with both hands, her face showing something closer to joy than anything Greta had seen from her since their capture, and for just a moment, the girl looked like what she should have been, a 19-year-old enjoying a good meal, rather than a prisoner of war, eating in silence under guard. Anna finally tried her own portion, and made a small sound of surprise that she quickly suppressed, her training reasserting itself even in the face of unexpectedly excellent fried chicken. And when their eyes met, there was a moment of shared acknowledgement that they'd stumbled into something they hadn't been prepared for, a small crack in the narrative they'd been told about American weakness and degeneracy. The American lieutenant, the woman who'd shown them to their barrack, was standing near the wall talking with one of the guards, and Greta noticed that she kept glancing toward their tables, her expression suggesting concern about how this whole situation was unfolding, as if she expected trouble at any moment. But there was no trouble, just the quiet sounds of eating and the occasional murmured comment in German, and Greta realized that for the first time since their capture, maybe for the first time in years, she felt something other than constant anxiety or exhaustion, felt instead a kind of stunned gratitude for this unexpected moment of comfort. The mashed potatoes were bland, and the green beans were overcooked into near mush, exactly the kind of institutional food she'd expected, but the chicken elevated the entire meal, transformed it from prison rations into something almost memorable, and she found herself eating every last bit on her plate, using the dinner roll to wipe up the remaining traces of grease and seasoning, because wasting food was unconscionable when you'd spent years being hungry. At other tables throughout the mess hall, male prisoners were finishing their meals and filing out, casting glances toward the women's section as they went, their expressions ranging from hostile to curious, and Greta understood that their presence here represented a disruption to the established order, a complication in a system that had probably been running smoothly before their arrival. She didn't care, not in this moment, with the warmth of hot food spreading through her body, and the immediate edge of hunger finally dulled, and she allowed herself the small luxury of not thinking about tomorrow or next week or whenever this war finally admitted it was over. Anna had finished her own meal and was looking at the empty tray with an expression Greta recognized as regret, that there wasn't more, and she whispered that if American prison camp food was this good, what must their soldiers be eating on the front line? What kind of logistics allowed them to feed even their prisoners better than Germany could feed its own troops? The question hung in the air between them, uncomfortable because they both knew the answer, both understood what it meant about resources and industrial capacity and all the reasons their side had been doomed from the start, but neither of them wanted to speak those thoughts aloud, not here, not. The walk back to the barracks felt different than the walk to the mess hall had, less tense somehow, though Sarah couldn't quite put her finger on what had changed except that the women were talking among themselves now, quiet conversations in German, that suggested some of the defensive posturing had relaxed, at least temporarily. The evening air had cooled considerably with the sunset, carrying that particular clarity that came with prairie nights, and overhead the first stars were beginning to appear in a sky that went on forever, in a way Sarah still hadn't quite gotten used to, despite months stationed here. Behind them, the mess hall was emptying out as the last of the male prisoners finished their dinners and headed back to their own barracks, the normal rhythm of camp life reasserting itself after the disruption of the women's arrival. Sergeant Davis walked beside Sarah, his rifle slung over his shoulder in that casual way that suggested he didn't expect trouble, but remained ready for it anyway, and after a long silence he commented that the evening had gone better than expected, that he'd half anticipated some kind of incident, but the prisoners had behaved themselves remarkably well. Sarah agreed, though she suspected the good behavior had less to do with discipline and more to do with exhaustion and the mollifying effects of decent food, but she kept that observation to herself because Davis was a good man and didn't need her amateur psychology cluttering up his simple worldview. They passed the camp hospital, a low building that stayed busy treating everything from work injuries to the inevitable illnesses that came from cramming thousands of people into close quarters, and Sarah saw Dr. Elizabeth Chen standing on the front steps, smoking a cigarette and watching the procession of women with professional interest. Chen had been the camp's only female physician since her assignment 6 months ago, and Sarah had developed a friendship with her, based on their shared experience of being women in an overwhelmingly male environment, though Chen had made it clear from the start that she didn't want special treatment or solidarity, just respect for her competence. She raised her cigarette in a kind of salute as they passed, and Sarah returned the gesture, a small acknowledgement that they were both navigating the same complicated situation, trying to maintain authority and professionalism while also dealing with the reality of gender in military spaces. The barracks loomed ahead, their wooden walls dark against the darkening sky, and Sarah could see that someone had already turned on the interior lights, casting a warm glow through the windows that made the buildings look almost welcoming despite their institutional nature. She'd inspected these barracks herself that afternoon, making sure they met the standards required by the Geneva Convention for housing prisoners, checking that the bunks were adequate and the facilities functional, going through the bureaucratic motions even though everyone knew that American POW camps were luxurious compared to what their enemies provided, that the real challenge wasn't meeting minimum standards but managing the strange guilt that came from treating captured soldiers better than many American citizens live. At the entrance to Barracks 7, the women began to file inside, and Sarah noticed how some of them moved more slowly now, the adrenaline that had probably kept them going through the day, finally wearing off and leaving them to face their exhaustion directly. Greta Zimmermann, the dark-haired sergeant who seemed to have emerged as the group's informal leader, paused at the doorway and turned back to look at Sarah, and for a moment their eyes met in that same charged silence as before, pregnant with all the things that couldn't be said between captor and captive. Then Greta nodded once, a gesture that might have been acknowledgement or gratitude or simply military courtesy, and disappeared into the barracks, leaving Sarah standing in the Oklahoma twilight, wondering what exactly had just transpired. Inside she could hear the sounds of women settling in for the night, the creak of bed springs and the murmur of conversation, normal human sounds that seemed strange coming from this place of fences and guards and enforced containment. Captain Warren appeared from the direction of the administration building, walking with that purposeful stride that suggested he had something on his mind, and when he reached Sarah he asked for her assessment of how the integration had gone, whether she anticipated any problems with the women's presence in the camp. Sarah gave him her most professional analysis, noting the initial tension but ultimate orderliness of the dinner, the apparent exhaustion of the prisoner, the fact that they seemed more relieved than hostile about their situation, all the observations that an officer was expected to make about the people under her charge. Warren listened with that distracted expression that suggested he was already thinking 3 steps ahead, already planning for the next challenge, and when she finished he grunted something that might have been approval before launching into a discussion of work assignments and daily schedules, and all the administrative details that went into running a facility this size. The women would need to be integrated into the camp's labor system, assigned to various work details that kept the prisoners occupied and contributed to the war effort, everything from laundry services to agricultural work to light manufacture, the kinds of tasks that the Geneva Convention permitted for enlisted prisoners. Sarah found herself only half listening as Warren outlined the plans, her mind still back in the mess hall, still watching those faces transform from suspicion to surprise as they encountered fried chicken for the first time, and she wondered whether that small moment of unexpected comfort would make their captivity easier or harder, whether it was kind or cruel to give them a taste of something good when they had so little control over their own lives. The camp's PA system crackled to life, announcing lights out in 30 minutes, the same announcement that echoed across the facility every night at the same time, one of those institutional rhythms that mark time in a place where days otherwise tended to blur together into an endless present tense. Warren finished his briefing and walked off toward his own quarters, leaving Sarah standing alone between the barracks, and she realized that she'd been on duty for nearly 14 hours and ought to get some sleep herself, but instead she found herself walking the perimeter of the women's section, checking that the guards were in position and alert, that everything was secure for the night, performing her duties with the kind of thoroughness that was probably unnecessary but made her feel like she had some control over a situation that seemed to be developing its own momentum regardless of what anyone planned. The days began to establish their own rhythm after that first night, a pattern of work and meals and supervised recreation that differed from the men's schedule only in minor details of timing and location. The military's attempt to maintain some separation while still running an efficient operation, Sarah found herself spending more time in the women's section than strictly necessary, telling herself it was important to monitor the integration process, but knowing on some level that she was drawn by curiosity about these people who'd become her responsibility, these women who'd served in an army that had terrorized Europe, but who now seemed mostly tired and confused, and eager to just get through each day without incident. Greta Zimmermann had been appointed by Captain Warren as the women's barracks leader, position that gave her certain responsibilities for maintaining order and communicating with the American authorities, and Sarah found herself dealing with Greta almost daily on various administrative matters, their interactions developing a kind of professional courtesy that existed separate from their roles as captor and captive. The morning after that first dinner, Sarah had assigned work details according to the women's backgrounds and capability, sending those with agricultural experience to help in the camp's extensive vegetable gardens that helped supplement the food supply, those with clerical skills to assist in various administrative offices, and those with no particular specialization to the laundry facilities that processed thousands of uniforms and linens every week. Helga Schneider, the young girl who'd cried during arrival, had been assigned to the gardens, and Sarah had seen her out there that first morning kneeling in the dirt beside an older American sergeant who was showing her how to properly transplant tomato seedlings, her face showing concentration rather than tears for the first time since Sarah had met her. The work was good for them, Sarah thought, gave them purpose and routine and a sense that time was moving forward rather than just endlessly cycling, though she knew some of the prisoners resented being made to contribute to the American war effort even in these indirect ways. The camp had been designed with work in mind, the theory being that idle prisoners would become restless and potentially troublesome, so every able-bodied man and now woman was expected to contribute 8 hours of labor per day, excluding Sundays and certain designated rest periods. The pay was nominal, military scrip that could be spent at the camp canteen on small luxuries like cigarettes and candy and writing paper, but for many prisoners it represented the only sense of agency they had, the only way to make choices about their own lives, even if those choices were limited to whether to buy a chocolate bar or save for a magazine. Sarah's duties had expanded to include oversight of several work details, which meant spending her mornings walking between different locations, checking on progress and resolving issues, and generally maintaining the illusion that someone was in charge of this vast machine of incarceration. At the laundry facility, Anna Richter supervised a team of women who processed mountains of clothing with industrial efficiency, their hands moving with practiced precision through washing and folding and sorting, transforming chaos into order in a way that probably satisfied something deep in their German souls, though Sarah knew she was indulging in stereotypes with that thought. The facility was hot and humid and filled with the smell of soap and bleach, and the women who worked there emerged each evening, looking exhausted but also somehow more settled, as if the physical labor helped ground them in this strange new reality. By the end of the first week, the presence of women in the camp had gone from shocking novelty to accepted fact, the kind of shift that happened when human beings demonstrated their remarkable capacity to normalize almost anything given enough time. The male prisoners still watched the women during the carefully scheduled times when their paths crossed, but the intensity of that attention had diminished, replaced by a kind of weary acceptance that this was how things were now, that the war had scrambled the normal order of the world and created situations that would have been unthinkable a few years earlier. Sarah noticed that some informal communication had developed between the men's and women's section. Notes passed through friendly guards, or messages conveyed by prisoners assigned to work details that brought them into contact, and while regulations technically forbade such fraternization, she found herself looking the other way, because preventing human connection seemed unnecessarily cruel when these people had already lost so much. The food remained a constant source of interest and discussion, particularly on the nights when Sergeant Thompson prepared his fried chicken, which happened roughly once a week depending on supply deliveries and the whims of the quartermaster. Sarah had learned from Hoffman that the women talked about the chicken almost obsessively, analyzing its preparation and comparing it to foods they'd known before the war, treating it as a kind of cultural artifact that needed to be understood and catalogued. Some of them had started asking Private Jackson questions about how it was made, their curiosity overcoming their reserve, and Jackson, who'd initially been wary of the German women, had warmed to their interest and begun explaining in his limited but enthusiastic way about the importance of proper seasoning and maintaining the right oil temperature. These small interactions felt important to Sarah, seemed to represent something meaningful about the possibility of human connection across the divisions of war and nationality and history, though she also recognized that she might be romanticizing what were really just mundane exchanges between people who happened to be in proximity. Dr. Chen had examined all the women during their first week, conducting the medical screenings required for new prisoners, and she'd reported to Sarah over dinner one evening that most of them were in surprisingly good health considering what they'd been through, though several showed signs of chronic malnutrition and stress-related ailments that would require ongoing monitoring. Chen had also mentioned in her characteristic blunt way that these were clearly educate-capable people who'd been caught up in something monstrous, but who weren't themselves monsters, and that Sarah should remember that distinction when dealing with them, as if Sarah needed reminding that the women under her supervision were human beings with their own stories and complexity. The idea for English classes had come from Greta, who'd approached Sarah during the second week with a formal written request that demonstrated both her command of written English and her understanding of military bureaucratic procedures, asking whether instruction might be arranged for those women who wanted to improve their language skills. Sarah had taken the request to Captain Warren, who'd initially been skeptical about devoting resources to education when there were so many other demands on camp personnel and facilities, but Sarah had argued that better communication would make camp management easier, and that occupied prisoners were less likely to cause problems, and eventually Warren had agreed to let her organize something on a trial basis. She'd volunteered to teach the first class herself, partly because there weren't many other options, and partly because she'd been looking for a way to engage with the prisoners beyond the purely administrative, to find some space where they could interact as something other than guard and guarded. The recreation hall had been set up with tables and chairs arranged in a rough approximation of a classroom, and on that first Tuesday afternoon 15 women had shown up, ranging from Helga, who could barely speak any English at all, to Greta, who was already quite fluent but wanted to refine her grammar and expand her vocabulary. Sarah had prepared a basic curriculum covering practical phrases and vocabulary that would be useful in daily camp life, but she'd quickly discovered that teaching adults was very different from the teaching she'd done as part of her education degree before the war, that these students came with their own motivations and questions, and a level of engagement that high school students rarely showed. Greta, in particular, asked challenging questions about English idioms and colloquialisms that Sarah sometimes struggled to explain, trying to articulate rules she'd absorbed unconsciously and now had to consciously examine, and those moments of mutual puzzlement had created a kind of leveling effect, a recognition that language was complicated and that understanding crossed both directions. The classes met 3 times a week in the late afternoon after work details had finished but before dinner, and over time they'd developed their own character, becoming less about formal instruction and more about conversation and exchange, with Sarah finding herself answering questions not just about English, but about American culture and customs, and the things that confused or interested the women about their new environment. Food came up constantly, naturally enough, with the students wanting to know the names of dishes and ingredients they encountered, and Sarah found herself explaining concepts like cornbread and grits and sweet tea, foods that were common in Oklahoma, but completely foreign to German palate. One afternoon, Anna had asked why Americans fried so many things, whether there was some cultural significance to the cooking method, and Sarah had tried to explain about Southern cuisine and its African-American root, about how enslaved people had developed cooking traditions that transformed cheap ingredients into something special, and she'd watched the women process that information with expressions that suggested they were grappling with aspects of American history they hadn't previously considered. The conversation had gotten complicated when someone asked about current conditions for Black Americans, and Sarah had found herself trying to explain segregation and Jim Crow laws to people who'd just emerged from Nazi Germany, trying to acknowledge her own country's failures, while also drawing some distinction between American racism and German genocide, and the whole discussion had left her feeling exhausted and uncertain about whether she'd said the right things or just made everything more confusing. But those difficult conversations felt important somehow, felt like they were all struggling together to understand the moral complexities of the world they lived in, rather than retreating into comfortable simplicities about good guys and bad guys, and Sarah had come to value the classes as much for her own education as for whatever she was providing the students. Private Jackson had started attending sometimes, sitting in the back and listening with interest, and eventually he'd offered to do a session about food and cooking, sharing stories about his grandmother's kitchen in Louisiana, and the traditions that had produced the fried chicken recipe the women found so fascinating. That class had been one of the most memorable, with Jackson demonstrating his natural gift for storytelling and the women listening with genuine interest as he described a world of family gatherings and Sunday dinners, and food as an expression of love and community. Afterward, several of the women had thanked him with a formality that suggested they weren't quite sure how to address a Black American soldier, and Jackson had handled their awkwardness with grace, seeming to understand that they were navigating unfamiliar territory and doing their best. The classes had created relationships that extended beyond the classroom, with Sarah finding herself greeted by name when she walked through the women's section, finding that conversations sometimes continued informally when she encountered students during her rounds. Helga had made particularly rapid progress, her young brain soaking up the language with impressive speed, and she'd started helping translate for some of the older women who struggled more with English, giving her a sense of purpose that had transformed her from that crying girl who'd arrived in the first truck to someone who walked with confidence and smiled readily. Sarah had learned fragments of their stories through these interactions, learned that Greta had been a school teacher before the war and had joined the Signals Corps because she'd believed she was defending her country, that Anna had worked in her family's bakery and still dreamed about the smell of bread rising, that Helga had been drafted straight out of gymnasium and had never even kissed a boy before finding herself in uniform and at war. These details had complicated Sarah's understanding of them as prison had made it harder to maintain that professional distance that was supposed to protect her from caring too much about people she was helping to imprison. She'd found herself wrestling with questions about justice and punishment and whether these particular individuals deserved to be locked up for their association with a regime they'd probably had little power to. Chen had told her during one of their dinners that she was getting too emotionally involved, that military service required maintaining clear boundaries between duty and feeling, but Sarah had countered that pretending these women weren't human seemed like its own kind of moral failure, and they'd argued about it in the friendly but intense way that characterized their relationship. The crisis came in the fourth week, on a night when Sarah had finally relaxed enough to believe that the integration had succeeded and that her job would settle into manageable routine. She'd been in her quarters writing a letter to her sister when the alarm sounded, that particular siren that meant something serious had happened, not a drill or routine security measure, but an actual emergency requiring immediate response. She'd grabbed her service weapon and run toward the sound of shouting, arriving at the central yard to find a scene of controlled chaos, guards converging from multiple directions, while a crowd of male prisoners had gathered in a hostile semicircle around something Sarah couldn't immediately see. Captain Warren was already there, his voice cutting through the confusion with orders to stand back and disperse, and as the crowd reluctantly gave way, Sarah saw what had triggered the response. Helga Schneider on the ground, her face bloodied, while a male prisoner was being restrained by two MPs, still struggling and shouting something in German that Sarah's limited vocabulary couldn't quite catch. The situation had that terrible potential energy of violence barely contained, of men on both sides looking for an excuse to escalate, and Sarah understood with sudden clarity that this was the kind of incident that could turn the entire camp hostile, could undo weeks of careful management in a matter of minutes. Greta had appeared from somewhere and was kneeling beside Helga, speaking to her in rapid German while trying to assess her injuries, and when she looked up at Sarah, her expression carried accusation and anger and a demand that something be done. Doc Chen arrived with her medical bag and immediately took over Helga's care, her professional efficiency creating a small bubble of calm in the midst of chaos, and after a quick examination she reported that the girl would be fine, that she had a split lip and some bruising, but nothing requiring more than basic first aid. The male prisoner being restrained was still shouting, and Mrs. Hoffman pushed through the crowd to translate, her face tight with disapproval as she listened to his tirade. What she reported made Sarah's blood run cold. The man was claiming that Helga had been passing information to the Americans, that she was a collaborator and a traitor, that she deserved punishment according to military law even though they were all prisoners and military law no longer applied. Warren ordered the man taken to isolation while he investigated the allegations, and as the MPs dragged him away the crowd began to disperse, but slowly, reluctantly, with backward glances that suggested this wasn't finished. Sarah helped Greta get Helga to the women's barracks, supporting the girl on one side while Greta took the other, and during that short walk, Helga wept again, not like the overwhelmed tears of a rival, but with the harsh sobs of someone who'd been betrayed, who'd believed she was finally finding her footing, only to discover that safety was an illusion. Inside the barracks, the other women had gathered in worried clusters, their faces showing fear about what this incident might mean for their situation, whether the fragile peace that had developed might now shatter into something darker. Greta got Helga settled on her bunk and then turned to Sarah with barely controlled fury, demanding to know how the Americans could allow such a thing to happen, how guards who were supposed to protect them had failed to prevent an assault. Her English becoming more rapid and less careful as her anger overcame her usual caution. Sarah tried to explain that they couldn't monitor every interaction, that the camps held thousands of prisoners, and incidents sometimes occurred despite best effort, but she could hear how inadequate that sounded, how much it resembled the kind of bureaucratic excuse-making that served no one's interests, except those who wanted to avoid accountability. She promised that there would be an investigation and that appropriate action would be taken, the kind of official assurance that was supposed to satisfy without committing to anything specific. But Greta wasn't satisfied and made that clear with a look that cut through all the diplomatic language to the reality underneath, which was that Helga had been hurt and Sarah's assurances about future prevention didn't undo that harm. The incident had occurred because Helga had been seen talking with Private Jackson near the kitchen, a conversation that had probably been about nothing more consequential than food or language practice, but that had been interpreted by some of the male prisoners as something more sinister, as collaboration with the enemy in ways that threatened the honor or safety of other prisoners. Warren's investigation would reveal over the following days that a small group of hardcore Nazi loyalists among the male prisoners had been increasingly resentful about the women's presence, viewing their apparent adaptation to camp life as weakness and their friendliness with guards as betrayal, and that the assault on Helga had been intended as a message to the other women about maintaining proper distance and loyalty. The man who'd attacked her was sentenced to 6 months in the camp's isolation unit, and Warren gave a speech over the PA system about regulations and consequences that was translated into German for the benefit of all prisoners. But Sarah knew that formal punishment wouldn't resolve the underlying tension, wouldn't change the fact that some prisoners viewed any kind of normal human interaction with Americans as betrayal, while others simply wanted to survive their captivity with as much dignity as possible. The women's section became more careful after that night, more withdrawn, and Sarah noticed that attendance at the English classes dropped significantly, that conversations which had been becoming more natural and relaxed now carried new caution. Helga herself recovered physically within a week but remained subdued, and Sarah saw how the incident had stolen something from her, had replaced that emerging confidence with a weariness that was probably appropriate given circumstances, but that Sarah mourned as a kind of casualty that wouldn't appear in any official record. The path towards some kind of resolution began unexpectedly a week after the assault, when Sarah encountered Greta near the kitchens during the morning work assignments, and Greta asked, with that careful formality that had returned to her speech, whether they might have a conversation about camp conditions. They'd found a quiet corner near the storage buildings where they could talk without being overheard by either prisoners or guards, and for several long minutes, Greta had simply stood there, obviously struggling with what she wanted to say, before finally explaining that the women felt trapped between competing demands, that they wanted to maintain their dignity and identity as German soldiers, but that they also to survive their imprisonment with some measure of peace, and that these two desires seemed increasingly incompatible. Sarah had listened without interrupting, understanding that what she was hearing represented a kind of trust that had been hard won and could easily be lost, and when Greta finished speaking, Sarah had tried to respond with equal honesty, admitting that she didn't have easy answers, but that she believed it was possible to be both German and decent, that loyalty to one's country didn't require hostility toward everyone else, that maybe the lesson of this whole catastrophic war was that those kinds of absolute divisions created only suffering. They'd talked for nearly an hour, their conversation ranging across topics that probably weren't appropriate for guard and prisoner, but that felt necessary anyway, discussing nationalism and identity, and what they owed to governments that had made terrible choices, and by the end Sarah felt like she'd glimpsed something of who Greta had been before the war, the teacher who'd cared about ideas and education, the woman who'd been buried under uniform and duty, but who still existed beneath the surface. That conversation had changed something between them, had created a channel of communication that felt different from official interactions, more honest somehow, and over the following weeks they'd found other opportunities to talk, conversations that Warren would have probably disapproved of if he'd known about them, but that Sarah came to value as one of the few genuine human connections she'd made during her time at Camp Crossroads. Private Jackson had become part of this unlikely group as well, his natural warmth and lack of military stiffness creating space for more relaxed interactions, and sometimes the three of them would end up together in the kitchen area preparing food while Sarah checked inventory and Greta supervised the women assigned to kitchen duties, and these moments had a quality of normalcy that felt precious given circumstances. Jackson had started teaching Greta some of his cooking techniques, showing her how to properly season the chicken before frying and explaining the importance of letting the meat rest at room temperature, treating her not as a prisoner, but as someone genuinely interested in learning. Greta had absorbed this knowledge with the same focus she brought to everything, asking questions and taking mental notes like she was documenting something important. One afternoon Jackson had looked at both women and said, in his straightforward way, that it seemed crazy that they were all stuck in this situation when they clearly could have been friends under different circumstances, and Sarah had felt the truth of that observation land with unexpected weight, making her confront how arbitrary the divisions between them really were, how much of what kept them on opposite sides of the wire was just accident of birth and history rather than anything essential about who they were as people. The English classes had resumed gradually with new students replacing some who'd dropped out, and Sarah had adjusted her approach to acknowledge the tension that now existed, addressing directly the question of what it meant to learn about American culture without betraying German identity, trying to create space where both could coexist. She'd started including more German literature and culture in the classes as well, asking the women to share poems or songs or stories from their own backgrounds, creating exchanges rather than one-way instruction. And these sessions had become some of the most valuable experiences of her military service, moments when she felt like she was doing something meaningful rather than just processing administrative details. Helga had slowly recovered her confidence and had even started attending classes again, though she remained more careful about her interactions with guards, and Sarah had made sure to include her in conversations and activities, trying to demonstrate that she wouldn't be abandoned or forgotten despite what had happened. The fried chicken nights had become explicitly acknowledged as special occasions, with the women openly expressing their appreciation and Jackson accepting their thanks with his characteristic smile, and these weekly meals had taken on an almost ceremonial quality, small celebrations of something that existed outside the normal prison camp categories. Sarah had written to her sister about these experiences, trying to explain what it felt like to be responsible for people who were technically enemies, but who seemed more like victims of circumstances beyond anyone's control, and her sister had written back with questions that Sarah couldn't easily answer about justice and forgiveness and whether kindness to prisoners dishonored those who died fighting against Germany. These questions troubled Sarah because she understood their logic even as she resisted their conclusions, understood that the same kindness that felt right in personal interactions might look like weakness or betrayal from the outside, that what made sense at the human level might not make sense at the political or historical level, and that she would probably spend years trying to reconcile these competing truths. Victory in Europe came in May, with celebrations that swept across America, but that created complicated emotions inside Camp Crossroads, where the prisoners had to confront what it meant that their country had been utterly defeated, that the regime they'd served no longer existed, that they were now people without a nation in any meaningful sense. Sarah had been in the administration building when the announcement came through official channels, and she'd watched Captain Warren's face shift from professional composure to genuine relief as he realized that the European war was finally definitively over, that the killing had stopped, and now came only the complicated work of peace. The camp's loudspeakers had broadcast the news to all prisoners in both English and German, and Sarah had gone out to observe the reactions, seeing the full range of human responses to momentous events, from relief to grief to a kind of numb shock that seemed to shut down all emotional processing. The American personnel celebrated with restrained enthusiasm, aware that they were surrounded by people for whom this news represented personal catastrophe, and Sarah had felt the awkwardness of her own relief, understanding that her joy at the war's end was inseparable from others' devastation, that these emotions existed in relationship rather than isolation. In the women's barracks, Greta had gathered everyone together and given a short speech in German that Sarah only partially understood, but that seemed to address the need to accept reality with dignity, to mourn what needed to be mourned, but to also recognize that survival was its own kind of victory, that they'd made it through when many hadn't, and that whatever came next would be faced together. Anna had wept openly during this speech, and several other women had joined her, releasing grief that had probably been building for years, while others had remained dry-eyed and still, their faces closed off in that way that suggested they'd process everything privately in their own time. Young Helga had looked lost, as if the end of the war had removed the last familiar landmark from her world, leaving her adrift in a present that no longer connected to any imaginable future, and Sarah had wanted to comfort her but didn't know how to bridge that gap between captor and captive, between winner and loser, between someone whose country had won and someone whose country no longer meaningfully existed. Captain Warren had announced that work details would continue as normal, that the end of the war didn't change anyone's immediate circumstance, though everyone understood that eventually these prisoners would need to be repatriated, or resettled or somehow reintegrated into a Germany that would look very different from the one they'd left. The practical questions about what happened next remained unanswered, with the bureaucracy of peace proving just as slow as the bureaucracy of war, and in the meantime the daily rhythms of camp life continued with their strange normalcy. That evening's dinner had been scheduled as a fried chicken night, and there'd been some discussion among the American staff about whether it was appropriate to serve a celebratory meal when half the camp was mourning, but Warren had decided that maintaining routine was more important than symbolic gestures, so the menu remained unchanged. Sarah had watched the women file into the mess hall with apprehension, unsure how they'd react to this particular meal on this particular day, but what she saw instead was a kind of grateful acceptance, as if the familiar comfort of good food provided an anchor in a day of emotional chaos. Sergeant Thompson had outdone himself with the preparation, creating what might have been the best batch of fried chicken he'd ever made, and Sarah had watched as the women ate with what looked like genuine appreciation despite everything else happening. She'd understood something about how human beings survived catastrophe by holding on to small pleasures and familiar rituals, Even when the larger world fell apart, Private Jackson had walked through the dining area checking on various tables, and when he'd passed the women's section, Greta had stopped him to say something in careful English, thanking him for the food and the kindness he'd shown them, and Jackson had responded with his characteristic grace, saying that cooking for people who appreciated it was its own reward, and that he hoped they'd all look back on this time as something more than just imprisonment. After dinner, Sarah had found herself walking the perimeter alone, processing her own complicated feelings about the day's event, thinking about what it meant that this chapter of history was closing, and what would be written in the next chapter, whether the peace would be wise enough to prevent future wars, or whether humanity would just repeat the same patterns in different forms. Dr. Chen had joined her after a while, and they'd walked together in silence before Chen had observed that wars ended, but the work of dealing with their consequences went on indefinitely, that these prisoners would carry their experiences forever, that Sarah herself would probably spend decades trying to understand what these months at Camp Crossroads had meant for her own sense of the world and her place in it. They'd talked about the women, about the changes they'd observed over weeks of proximity, about how people revealed themselves under pressure, and what those revelations suggested about human nature more broadly, and Sarah had admitted that these months had taught her things about moral complexity that no philosophy course could have conveyed, that she'd learned to hold multiple truths simultaneously, even when they contradicted each other, that she'd become comfortable with uncertainty in ways that would have been impossible before the war. The repatriation orders came in October when the leaves were changing colors, and the Oklahoma air had taken on that crisp quality that promised winter ahead, and Sarah had felt an unexpected heaviness when she'd learned that the women would be leaving within 2 weeks, returning to a Germany that had been divided among the victors, and that bore little resemblance to the country they'd left. The processing began immediately, with Captain Warren's office working through mountains of paperwork to determine each woman's final destination, trying to match them with whatever remained of their families and homes, though everyone understood that many would find nothing waiting for them except ruins and displacement. Sarah had helped coordinate the departure preparations, checking names against manifests and arranging transportation, and trying to ensure that the women received whatever personal belongings had been stored when they'd arrived, all the bureaucratic details that marked the end of their captivity, but that couldn't address the larger questions about what their lives would become. Greta had approached her during this hectic period, and asked whether they might have one final conversation before departure, and they'd found their usual spot near the storage buildings where they'd had so many previous talks, and for a long time they'd simply stood together watching the camp's activity without speaking. Eventually Greta had said, in English that had improved dramatically over the months, that she wanted Sarah to know that her kindness had mattered, that the English classes and the small dignities and even the fried chicken had reminded them that they were human beings rather than just categories to be processed, and that she would remember this place, not as a prison, but as somewhere she'd learned important things about herself and the world. Sarah had felt tears threatening, and had fought them back because crying seemed unprofessional, even though she suspected that professional distance had ceased to be relevant or possible months ago, and she'd tried to articulate something about how the women had taught her equally important lessons about resilience and dignity, and the complexity of people who found themselves on the wrong side of history through circumstances that offered few clear choices. They'd talked about what came next, about Greta's plans to try to find her family and hopefully return to teaching, if schools were being rebuilt, about her fear that Germany would be permanently broken, and her hope that somehow people would find ways to create something better from the ruin. Sarah had promised to write if Greta sent her an address, knowing even as she made the promise that the chaos of post-war Europe might make that impossible, that they might never communicate again despite these months of connection, but wanting to offer that small gesture toward a future that extended beyond their current roles. The other women had their own farewells to make, saying goodbye to the teachers and work supervisors and guards who'd become familiar presences in their daily lives, and Sarah had watched these interactions with a sense of witnessing something significant, the dissolution of a community that had formed under the strangest of circumstances but that had nonetheless been real. Private Jackson had prepared one final fried chicken dinner for the women's last night at camp, pulling out all the stops to create a meal that would serve as a proper send-off, and that evening the mess hall had felt less like a prison cafeteria, and more like a farewell party where the guest of honor happened to be leaving, under duress. Jackson had given a short speech, translated by Miss Hoffman, about how cooking brought people together, and how he'd been honored to feed them and how he hoped they'd find good food and better times wherever they ended up, and several of the women had applauded despite regulations about maintaining proper prisoner decorum. Young Helga, who'd grown from that frightened teenager into a more confident young woman over these months, had given Sarah a small drawing she'd made, a sketch of the camp that somehow captured both its institutional grimness and the small moments of unexpected humanity that had occurred within its fences, and Sarah had accepted it with genuine gratitude, understanding that this represented a kind of trust that transcended the barriers that were supposed to exist between them. The morning of departure had arrived with that kind of crisp clarity that made everything seem sharply defined, and Sarah had supervised the loading of the trucks with a heavy awareness that this particular chapter of her life was ending, that she would probably never see any of these women again despite the connections that had formed. The women assembled in formation, one last time, standing at attention while Captain Warren delivered formal remarks about their conduct and repatriation, and Sarah had noticed how different they looked from those exhausted prisoners who'd arrived 6 months earlier, how they stood with more confidence and less fear, as if the experience of surviving captivity had given them something to build on. Greta had been last to board her truck, and she'd paused at the tailgate to look back at Sarah one final time, and they'd exchanged a look that carried all the things that couldn't be said in this public moment, all the complexity of their relationship and the strange gift of having known each other under these circumstances. And then she'd climbed aboard and the truck had pulled away toward the gates, joining the convoy that would take them to the port and eventually across the Atlantic to whatever remained of home. Sarah had stood watching until the trucks disappeared from sight, and then she'd remained there for several more minutes, reluctant to return to the administrative tasks that would fill the space these women had occupied in the camp's daily life, unwilling to let go of this moment that felt like the end of something that had mattered more than she'd understood while it was happening. Doc Chen had found her there eventually and had observed, in her characteristic direct way, that Sarah had done good work with a difficult situation, that the women had been lucky to have someone who'd treated them as human beings rather than just problems to be managed, but that now came the harder work of integrating these experiences into whatever came next in Sarah's life and career. They'd walked back toward the administration building together, and Sarah had realized that the camp felt emptier now, despite still housing thousands of male prisoners, as if the women's presence had filled some space that went beyond mere numbers, had added some quality that their absence now made painfully obvious. The weeks that followed had been strange, with Sarah finding herself walking past the women's barracks and remembering conversations and classes and small moments that had accumulated into something meaningful, and she'd understood that she would carry these memories and the questions they raised about justice and compassion and human connection across the divisions of war and nationality for the rest of her life. A letter had arrived eventually months later from Greta, postmarked from the British zone of occupation, and containing news that she'd found her sister alive, and that they were working together to rebuild their family's home, and that she'd started teaching again at a makeshift school. And the letter had ended with a recipe for apple cake and a note that someday, if circumstances allowed, she hoped they might share a meal as friends rather than as guard and prisoner. And Sarah had kept that letter in her desk drawer as a reminder that even the strangest circumstances could create genuine human bonds that deserved to be honored rather than forgotten.